Good afternoon. My name is Steve Warren. I am the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers business representative for Southern Alberta, and thank you all for joining us here today at the Boilermakers Lodge 146 in Calgary. We, the Boilermakers Lodge 146, acknowledge the traditional and ancestral territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis settlements and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Regions 2, 3, and 4, within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, Inuit, who have lived and cared for these lands for generations. We are grateful for the knowledge keepers and elders who are still here today and those who have gone before us. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are currently visiting. Thank you to the members of Parliament, the AFL, the union leaders, the union members, and the union supporters for joining us here today. And thank you to the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, for taking the time to come speak with us. I would also like to give a quick thank you to everyone that helped organize this event. Hugh, Sean, Kayla, Antonio, Alex, Ange, MC, and Hannah, to name a few. I am now pleased to announce our next speaker, the President of the Alberta Federation of Labour, Mr. Gil McGowan.
Thanks very much, Steve. You guys might not know this, but before I was president of the Federation of Labour and a labor activist, I was also a reporter. So I know that some of you may have been sent here to talk about or ask questions about things like, say, Disney+. But I urge you to focus on two other words. Two words which are much more consequential and which were the subject of the conversations that we were lucky to have with Minister Freeland today. Those two words are industrial policy. Industrial policy is what allowed Western Europe to rise from the ashes after the Second World War. Industrial policy is what turned Japan and South Korea into industrial powerhouses. Industrial policy is what built the oil sands industry and the petrochemical industry here in Alberta. Industrial policy is also the phrase that Minister Freeland used in her fall economic statement last week. And it was the subject of the conversations that she had with us. We had a roundtable with labor leaders for about an hour and a half earlier this morning. And as the representative for the Alberta Federation of Labour, and as a spokesman and advocate for literally 170,000 working people in this province, I can't tell you how thrilled and excited I am to have a partner in government that's willing to use the power of government, the funding of government, to help us make that pivot towards a new economy, a new kind of economy in our province. Because whether we like it or not, the world is going through a transition. That transition is scary, but it also presents all sorts of opportunities that we can seize if we have a vision and we have a direction, and dare I say, if we have an industrial policy that allows us to do in the 21st century what Peter Lougheed did with industrial policy in the 70s and 80s to create the oil sands and the petrochemical sector. So that's what we were talking about for the better part of the morning this morning when the minister sat down with myself as a representative of the Alberta Federation of Labour. We had representatives from the Boilermakers, the operating engineers, the electrical workers, people who actually represent tens of thousands of working Albertans in this province. So there may be a story of the day, There may be a shiny little bauble that you want to chase after, but I urge you, the biggest story that is unfolding right now in the conversations in the boardroom behind us, and the conversations that we're having with the labor movement, the business community, with ordinary working Albertans in this province, the biggest story is the unfolding the demonstrated willingness on behalf of the federal government to embrace this idea of industrial policy to make sure that Alberta's economic future is as bright as the last few decades have been. So with that, I'm going to introduce George Chahal, who is one of the MPs from the federal government who joined us for what I think was a really consequential discussion this morning. So I'll introduce George to say a few remarks. George?
Good afternoon, and thank you for the warm welcome. I first want to thank the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers for hosting us today. Last week, we saw the release of the fall economic statement that will support our economy and workers. I'm honored and privileged today to introduce a good friend and colleague whose third visit to Alberta has been made this year. Last time we had the opportunity to get to a farm in Olds, Fresh Pal Farms, and meet a newcomer family who set up a farm in Olds, Alberta. Today was a great discussion with union leaders about the future of our economy and the opportunities ahead. Thank you to my colleague and friend, the MP from University Rosedale, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Alberta's very own Chrystia Freeland.
Thanks. Okay, well, thank you for those very warm introductions. Bonjour tout le monde. Je tiens d'abord à souligner que nous sommes réunis sur les territoires traditionnels des peuples de la région du Traité 7, dans le sud de l'Alberta, de la nation métisse de l'Alberta, région 3. I am really glad to be back in Alberta, to be back in Calgary, with my friend and colleague, George Chahal, who is such a strong voice for the people of his community and really for the people of Calgary and Alberta. We were together with Alberta labor leaders, with the Boilermakers, with the Alberta Federation of Labor in Edmonton just last month. And it is great to meet again. It is great to learn more from Kyla about welding and to meet some wonderful apprentices. I'm very grateful for the hospitality. Now, when we were in Edmonton just a few weeks ago, one of the things we spoke about was the role that union workers are playing and will play in helping to build a thriving, worker-driven economy as Canada navigates the road to net zero. That was one of the pillars of the fall economic statement I tabled last Thursday. A growing economy that will create good jobs for workers right across the country. An economy that will have workers, union workers, leading the way. That was one of the pillars in the fall economic statement because we know that the global economy is changing. And our government believes that this changing global economy represents a generational opportunity for Canada and Canadian workers, for Alberta and for Albertan workers. We believe that for two reasons. First, because the global green transition is the most significant economic transition in the world since the Industrial Revolution itself. And because here in Canada, here in Alberta, we have an abundance of the resources, from energy to critical minerals and beyond that will power that transition. And second, because since Vladimir Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, our allies and their leading businesses are increasingly looking to Canada to provide them with these resources. This can be, and it will be, an incredible opportunity for union workers in our country. And that is especially true for workers here in Alberta. Alberta energy workers are the very best in the world, and they will make Canada the leading provider of energy in a net zero world. The skilled workers in this province have been the driving force of Alberta's economy for generations. And whether it is building TMX or supplying clean, low-carbon energy or building more of the housing that our growing country needs, our government wants workers here in Alberta to continue driving our economy forward. That's why when we introduced major tax credits for clean technology and clean hydrogen in last week's fall economic statement, we attached labor conditions to them for the very first time. That means that if companies want to receive the full value of these very generous tax credits, they will need to pay the prevailing wage in their local market. It means companies will need to create apprenticeship opportunities. And as we finalize the labor conditions for these tax credits, we will be working directly with unions, directly with the people here today, on how we can best ensure that workers benefit from these tax credits. These tax credits will be critical in our efforts to build a net zero economy. They also show that workers can and should and must help lead the way on the road to get there. Which is why, in the fall economic statement, we're also investing to ensure that workers have the skills they need to continue working in good jobs for decades to come. We'll work with unions through the new Sustainable Jobs Training Centre to equip workers with the long-term skills they need. We're investing in a new sustainable jobs stream of UTIP to support union-based training that will help 20,000 apprentices and journey persons. And I saw the incredible impact of this program firsthand today. You see some of the people behind me. We're also making it easier for young people to pursue an apprenticeship by permanently eliminating interest on the federal portion of Canada Student Loans and Canada Apprentice Loans. And whether it was launching the new Canada Growth Fund to create good jobs and fight climate change at the same time, or strengthening our supply chains, or improving the regulatory process for major projects, the fall economic statement takes real steps to help create more opportunities for workers in Alberta. Because what workers here in Alberta know is that the single most important thing, the difference between managing to pay your mortgage and fearing you could lose your home, the difference between paying the bills at the end of the month and falling behind, is a well-paid, stable job. Doing work you're proud of with people who respect you and your skills. And that is why what workers in Alberta need now and in the years to come is a government with a real, robust industrial policy, a government committed to investing in the net zero transition, to bringing in new private investment, and to helping create more good jobs. And that is exactly what our government is doing. Because if we make smart choices today, if we seize the economic opportunity before us, we can ensure a new era of prosperity for workers and families like the ones here in Calgary. Yet, even as we make investments in our future, it is still a challenging time for Canadians today. Interest rates are rising, and our economy is slowing down, as are those of our friends and allies around the world. While inflation fell in September for the third month in a row, it is still too high, and it has been making life more expensive for working people and especially for the most vulnerable among us. Which is why, in addition to the steps we're taking in the fall economic statement to grow our economy and create good jobs, we also introduced new measures to enhance Canada's social safety net and provide inflation relief to the Canadians who need it most. We're creating a new, enhanced Canada Workers Benefit that will deliver advanced quarterly payments and ensure our lowest paid and often most essential workers don't have to wait until the end of each year to receive the support they need today. Nous travaillons à offrir des soins dentaires aux enfants de moins de 12 ans. Personne ne devrait avoir à choisir entre emmener son enfant chez le dentiste et mettre de la nourriture sur la table. Nous fournirons des centaines de dollars en nouvelle aide aux locataires à faible revenu qui ont de la difficulté à payer leur loyer. Et pour les Canadiens qui en ont le plus besoin, nous doublons le crédit pour la TPS pendant 6 mois. Les paiements ont commencé à être versés à 11 millions de ménages canadiens vendredi dernier. Cela signifie qu'un répit bien nécessaire a commencé à arriver pour aider les gens à payer la nourriture, l'épicerie ou le loyer. We're providing targeted inflation relief because it's the right thing to do. And we can do it because while we're compassionate, we're also responsible. In fact, Canada has the lowest deficit and the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. Just last week, Moody's reaffirmed our AAA rating with a stable outlook. And in October alone, employment in Canada rose by 108,000 jobs. That means there are 513,000 more Canadians working today than before COVID first hit. Our economy is now 103% the size it was before the pandemic. And so far this year, our economic growth has been the strongest in the G7. All of this shows that our pandemic spending worked. It means we're entering the global economic slowdown from a position of fundamental economic strength, with more Canadians employed and with the fiscal firepower we need to respond to whatever the global economy may throw at us. There really is no country in the world that is better placed than Canada to weather the global slowdown. Canadians are tough, and the Canadian economy is resilient. And that's why we can all be confident that we'll get through this, just as we have gotten through so much over these past 2.5 years. And once we do, there is no country in the world better placed to thrive than Canada. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Rick Bell, Calgary Sun. Gil knows me well enough to know I'm a sucker for those shiny baubles. But I think the question will probably, it is timely, and your answer may reflect on some of the concerns that were raised. Predictably, right after by-election victory last night, the new Premier of Alberta sent a letter to the Prime Minister talking about A, why don't you get rid of the carbon tax? B, why don't you pause the carbon tax increases? C, why don't you temporarily pause the federal fuel tax? in a two-page letter. None of that will come to you as a surprise. You've been questioned about it in the House of Commons as well by the opposition. Could you explain why those things are not, in your opinion, a good idea?
So thanks for the question. And let me start by congratulating Premier Smith on her by-election victory. I am sure that she and her government and our government will disagree about a lot of things. But I'm also sure that there are a lot of things that we will agree on and that we do agree on. And one thing I really learned during the NAFTA negotiations is that Canada is strongest and we're most effective when we're able to take a Team Canada approach. And when we are able to really try to focus on the areas where we agree and work together on those. I'm going to start by mentioning some of those and the areas, many of them mentioned in that letter, where I hope we can work together, and then I will address those areas of differences that you mentioned, Rick. So I was encouraged to see in that letter the reference to SMRs and to CCUS. Both of those are areas where our government is committed to making significant investments. Those investments were reinforced in the fall economic statement. And I very much look forward to working with Premier Smith and her government in investing together in those opportunities for Alberta, Albertan workers, and for Canada. There's a lot of work to be done. I think we can do a lot of positive things together. You mentioned a couple of other areas where we do disagree, and I'm going to touch on two of them. The first is the price on pollution. And I think it is worth pointing out that the price on pollution is in fact revenue neutral. None of that money falls to the federal bottom line. In all jurisdictions that have the backstop, that money is returned 100% to the jurisdiction. As people in Alberta know, that means a family of four is receiving more than $1,000 back. I also want to point out that the idea of a price on pollution has a pretty respectable Albertan intellectual lineage. Preston Manning was an early advocate of putting a price on pollution. He saw that, and I think he is right, as one of the most economically effective mechanisms for taking climate action. I agree with that view, and that's why our government is moving forward. One other area that I do want to mention that was mentioned in the letter is to really be clear with Canadians, today with Albertans, about the high priority our government places on fiscal responsibility. I really understand that today, as the global economy is slowing down, as we continue to face elevated inflation, one of the jobs of the federal government is not to make the work of the Bank of Canada harder. That is why Canada today has the lowest deficit in the G7. We have the lowest debt to GDP ratio in the G7. And we received some very important external validation of the soundness of our fiscal stewardship on Thursday evening after markets closed, after I tabled the fall economic statement. And that came from Moody's, the international credit rating agency, which reaffirmed Canada's AAA rating, that's the highest rating they have, with a stable outlook.
Yes, a quick follow-up. As I say, when the Premier was running for her party leadership, which having won that, she became the Premier. She hasn't faced the Alberta electorate yet. That's coming soon. She campaigned on two things, and one of them was that her predecessor, who you know well, former Premier Jason Kenney, didn't stand up to Ottawa enough, wasn't hard enough on Ottawa, didn't challenge Ottawa enough. And you are part of Ottawa in this drama. How do you respond when we now have a government led by somebody who did run on pushing back a lot more against the federal government? I understand you're going to talk about how you can work together on some files, but she also ran and won her leadership saying, we haven't done enough, we haven't pushed back, whether it's the Sovereignty Act or on other things, they're doing terrible things to us, and I am going to push harder than my predecessor. How do you react, especially in light of the fact that not only are you the Deputy Prime Minister, but you're also from, I believe, the Peace River country? So how do you react to all that, that we now have a Premier who is going to be more assertive, dare I say combative, with Ottawa than even her predecessor?
Rick, if I may, that's a really good question. And like all good journalists, you've anticipated my answer. Look, I really, truly, and sincerely love Alberta. I really do. And I really, truly, and sincerely believe in the people of Alberta, and I really believe in what is special about this amazing province. I, therefore, really believe that my job, the federal government's job, is to do everything we can to roll up our sleeves and to work with the people of Alberta. I'm here today, Gil said we did have a great conversation, to work with Alberta union leaders. This afternoon, I'm going to have a meeting at the Chamber of Commerce to work with Alberta businesses, to work with Albertan political leaders, Alberta's elected political representatives. I have a good working relationship with Travis Toews, and I look forward to continuing to work with him, to work with Alberta MPs, one of whom is here right now. And we as a government are really going to continue to focus on what we can do as a federal government to support the people of Alberta, to support them with the challenges today, and to invest in the future, and to work with everyone in Alberta who wants to work with us.
Josh Aldridge, Calgary Herald. You just said you had a really good working relationship with Travis Toews. What's your working relationship like with Premier Smith? How would you characterize that?
I am looking forward to working with Premier Smith. Obviously, her direct counterpart is the Prime Minister, but I am happy to meet with her and work with her.
But you haven't. Oh. This would be my second question. Okay. All right. I have to ask for a colleague. Two-part question. The Pathways Alliance Oil Sands Group is seeking greater incentives to the investment tax credit for carbon capture utilization and storage projects to make it competitive with the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, but there were no changes to it in the fall economic update. Are increases to the ITC still coming that the federal government is considering? And secondly, are you concerned that the Alliance hasn't moved forward on its carbon capture project and major capital investments?
Okay, wow, you packed a lot in there. So I'm going to start by saying I really look forward to coming back to Alberta soon, I hope, to join with provincial leaders, to join with union leaders, and to join with business leaders, and to announce a big CCUS project. That will be great news for Alberta. It will be great news for Canada. It will be great news for climate action in the world. I really want that to happen, and I believe it can and it will. That's why we have put on the table very significant CCUS incentives. The federal government is there, and we have skin in the game. I know the Pathways Alliance is working hard as well. It's an issue we also discussed earlier today with union leaders, and I heard a lot of enthusiasm for moving ahead. And I would really love to see the province get actively, energetically involved too.
Alison Dempster, CBC. This is sort of a follow-up to Rick's question, but more specifically, I guess I'd just like to hear you speak about the Sovereignty Act that we're expecting. Premier Smith has said it's her first order of business November 29th when the legislature starts sitting. So when that bill arrives, what is the federal government's approach? What is your strategy?
Alison, one of the things that I learned during the NAFTA negotiations was never to comment on hypotheticals. We will look forward to working with the province of Alberta, and we'll look closely at any legislation the new Premier tables and respond to it when we have something in writing to respond to.
Oui, Marc-Antoine, Radio-Canada. Moi, je vais vous amener sur la COP27. Comment est-ce que vous justifiez que le pavillon canadien, la COP27 en Égypte, accorde autant de place aux représentants des industries fossiles qui sont finalement la principale source de nos émissions?
Je suis convaincue que pour le Canada, l'approche gagnante, c'est toujours l'approche d'équipe Canada. C'est vrai en ce qui concerne la captage de carbone qu'on a juste discuté, et c'est la réalité en ce qui concerne l'action climatique. Pour vraiment avoir une politique concernant le climat qui est efficace, qui fonctionne, on doit avoir tous les partis à la table. Les travailleurs, et on a discuté l'action climatique aujourd'hui, on doit avoir les entreprises, toutes les entreprises émettantes, incluant les entreprises énergétiques. On doit avoir tous les niveaux du gouvernement. C'est comment on pourra réduire nos émissions en travaillant ensemble.
Est-ce que c'est possible de dire ça en anglais pour nos collègues des autres réseaux?
Bien sûr. I really believe that the approach that works really on all of the big issues facing our country is a Team Canada approach. And that applies equally to climate action. To effectively act on climate change, to effectively reduce our emissions, we need all the players at the table. We need organized labor at the table, and climate action was one of the issues we discussed today. We need all levels of government at the table, federal governments, provincial governments, municipal governments, and we need industry at the table as well. That's where the emissions are. We need the energy industry at the table, we need the steel industry at the table, we need aluminum industry at the table, we need everyone there. It is by working together that we will reduce our emissions and at the same time seize the very real economic opportunities which the green transformation presents for Canada and for Alberta.
Et qu'est-ce que vous répondez aux personnes qui disent que c'est contre-intuitif dans la mesure où plusieurs experts disent qu'on doit tout simplement abandonner l'utilisation des énergies fossiles?
Je pense que c'est vraiment important de comprendre que pour vraiment réduire nos émissions, pour aller des mots, des idées à l'action réelle, pratique, c'est nécessaire d'avoir la participation active de toutes les industries du Canada et aussi des travailleurs. Je veux souligner aussi l'importance de travailler avec les travailleurs, avec les syndicats. Si on veut réduire nos émissions, on doit travailler avec nos industries parce que nos industries sont une importante source de nos émissions. C'est l'approche de notre gouvernement et on va continuer de travailler avec toute l'équipe du Canada pour réduire nos émissions, qui est si important pour le climat.
Serait-il possible de dire ça aussi en anglais pour les collègues?
Sure. Look, industrial emitters, including the energy sector, are an important source of Canada's emissions. And so from my perspective, it absolutely makes sense to be working with industry to bring our emissions down across all sectors, to be working with the auto sector, to be working with the steel sector, to be working with the energy sector. Our government understands that's necessary. Labor needs to be very much a part of the conversation, and that's why I'm here today. And that is the work that we're going to continue to do.
Hey, Tim Brooke with CTV. We're a number of weeks in now. I just want to know, in your own words, how has the Emergencies Act inquiry been going thus far?
I think it's a very important part of Canada being a living, functioning, healthy democracy. Invoking the Emergencies Act was a very serious decision for our government. It was a hard decision to take, and it should be a hard decision to take. It is an action that should never be taken lightly, and we did not undertake it lightly. I believed at the time, and I believe now, that it was the right thing to do, that it was necessary for our country. I think it's really good that Canadians are being given a chance to hear in an impartial, independent setting testimony from some of the key people involved. I will be testifying later this month. And that's, as will the Prime Minister, as will other cabinet ministers, and that's important.
The Mayor of Coots, Jim Willett, testified today. He said a number of times that he thought both Edmonton, our provincial government, and Ottawa, your government, were essentially caught off guard by the size of these protests. I'd just love to hear your response to that. Do you think Ottawa was ready for what he says a lot of people knew was coming?
Ottawa, the city, or Ottawa, the federal government?
Ottawa, the federal government.
What Canada faced at just the beginning of this year, actually, was a very serious challenge and threat to our national security and our economic security. The degree to which that threat was unprecedented, I think, is measured in the fact that our government needed to invoke the Emergencies Act to bring the blockades to an end and to guarantee Canada's national security. So it was a very big deal. I hope and believe it is the kind of thing that happens only once in a generation, if that. I'm glad we brought it to an end. That was important for Canada.
Hi, Colette DeWars with the Canadian Press. Question from my colleagues in Ottawa. They are asking about workers are seeing their real wages fall despite labor shortages. Do you support unions and workers asking for wage increases that make up for inflation?
I support unions working hard to represent their members. I really believe that when workers are organized, when they are able to speak together through their unions, that is how you ensure that workers are well paid for their important work. And I think really it's very important for us as a government, for us as a society, to recognize the important role that workers and organized labor plays in building our country and needs to play in shaping our economy. That's why I was here today.
That concludes today's press conference. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks a lot.